So when I started this notion of doing Inside the Lords, it was to hopefully shine a light on some of the behind the scenes things that go on in the House of Lords, which is more important than people give it credit for in terms of changing legislation. And I've sort of ended up just often ranting about what I've done in the House of Lords and making some political points. But today I thought I'd introduce a few new things that I've learned. So the first one was that I went to this brilliant debate this week in Parliament, which was called the Westminster Hall debates. I've heard of these before, but I didn't know what they were. Westminster Hall debates are actually one of the ways that the public can get heard in Parliament, because if you get a petition together and you get over 100,000 signatories and you send it to Parliament, then they have to put on a debate. So there is a committee room of Westminster Hall, which is that old part of the building in which the Queen was laid in state. So you will have seen it on the telly. One of those committee rooms, and it's not the main chamber, but MPs only can speak. But what's important is that it's the minister responsible for the area has to turn up. So there was a historic debate this week in which there was two petitions, one from gender critical supporters who want clarification on the equalities law in relation to sex versus gender, and there was also a petition from the trans allies and activists who said that there should be no change to the Equalities Act and that this was an attack on trans rights. So they combined both petitions, and for the first time, and it really is genuinely historical, in Parliament, MPs from both sides of the divide were in the same room and had to argue. So I was quite excited. I was told that as a member of the House of Lords I could just swan in, but actually I couldn't. The guy said, no, you have to go. So it was such a big queue that I ended up in the overflow room, which was actually rather good fun because you could swear and sort of generally be loud and sort of go, well, Alfred, ridiculous, and so on and so forth. Well, in the course of that debate, what was really interesting was that there was, in terms of the numbers, there was more gender critical MPs who spoke than on the other side. Well, they could have brought more people, but they didn't. So quantity wasn't there, and quality, the quality of the remarks was really very strong from those arguing for ensuring that sex-based rights are protected in the Equalities Bill. But there was just some fantastic speeches, so do check it out. But something else significant happened was, because MPs were put on the spot, we got a situation where Jess Phillips, who is, as we know, a Labour Party MP, a prominent women's rights campaigner, who has been ambivalent, and that is the understatement of the year, around the issue of gender and sex, actually made a speech in which she firmly came out in support of the importance of women-only spaces in relation to domestic abuse, refuges, and so on and so forth. That's significant. It might have been a narrow way that she did it, but it wasn't the point. She did it, and I think that it was because it was in Westminster that mattered. And also Annalise Dodd, the Labour spokesperson, the shadow, was also forced to speak, and she made a more mediated, better speech than we'd expect from the Labour Party, let's put it that way. And I thought that was a very interesting thing that happened in Parliament this week. Another thing that happened that's caused quite a kerfuffle is that there was a row about the Public Order Bill and the fact that Jenny Jones had put in a fatal motion. So let me explain what happened. When the Public Order Bill was going through Parliament, at the last minute, the government introduced a series of amendments, and they introduced those amendments in the Lords. Now, the role of the Lords is to scrutinise legislation that's been designed in the Commons, and then there's a row about which amendments are accepted and so on and so forth. I describe that every week. In this instance, when amendments are introduced in the Lords can have the final say. If they are introduced in the Lords and they are defeated in the Lords, that's the end of those amendments. And it was really disgusting because the government had introduced these amendments late in the night at report stage of a particular piece of legislation, we were all furious because it meant that there was hardly anyone around and so on and so forth. And at report stage, when you vote on them, anyway, one way or another, the government got defeated. They failed. That's a year ago, right? A year later, the government has brought through a statutory instrument which effectively reintroduces one of those amendments or several of those amendments in the form of a statutory instrument which cannot be challenged by anyone in the Commons or in the Lords. It is a power given to the Secretary of State. In other words, they lost the argument in Parliament and they cheated and brought in this statutory instrument, which they say is an absolute urgent necessity to deal with people walking slowly down the middle of the road, as in Just Stop Oil, which is absolutely ludicrous. I mean, if you jaywalk or walk in the middle of the road as a civilian normally, the police don't let you do it, right? The idea that they stand there and let people do that from Just Stop Oil is because the police are ineffective. But this was a constitutional breach, and the government used that as an excuse, popular excuse, because everybody that slow walking gets on everyone's nerves, to bring in something that was really against the spirit of the way you make laws. Jenny Jones from the Greens therefore introduced a fatal motion. Now the problem with this is a fatal motion is where you just strike down a piece of legislation. And even though a statutory instrument can't be challenged, amended or effectively dealt with, it had been voted on in the Commons that day. And so it had the backing, I mean, whether we like it or not, of the elected House. So she brings in this fatal motion. The Labour Party decide that they can't go along with the fatal motion because it would be wrong to overturn a decision by an elected government, even if the elected government was unconstitutional. And so they brought in a regret motion. And so, therefore, a massive row occurred. Jenny Jones represents the Green Party, but she had got the backing of the Liberal Democrats and many law lords, who effectively said, the House of Commons isn't working, we, the House of Lords, should take over, we should strike this down. Now, the Labour Party, to their credit, stuck with the argument that we can't set the precedent of people who don't like what's happening in the elected House wandering in and introducing fatal motions. And I spoke on that very thing myself and backed the Labour Party on it. But it's interesting because so many people who are anti the protest laws will then say, and have said, the Labour Party is shills, you know, they're selling out, this shows they're right wing. And I am not a fan of the Labour Party in many instances, but they did the right thing there. They were right. And Lord Rooker even made the point, from the floor, that he said that, this really will be us lowering to their standards. It will be actually us behaving worse than the government. So I'm not going to do it. And he, I think, even voted with the government on their amendment because he was so determined not to be seen to be trying to use the Lords in a particular way. I do think that the Lords and a lot of the speeches who were supporting Jenny Jones kept making the point that the Commons isn't working, we at the Lords. It's like a kind of self-aggrandising, we in the Lords must deal with this. Now, in view of the controversy around Boris Johnson's peerages list and people saying how dare he appoint his cronies, it was really interesting in that debate that there was at least some self-reflection by a number of people who spoke against the fatal motion, saying we have to remember our place. We were appointed here. In other words, I made the point that everyone was somebody's crony, and everyone got appointed by somebody, and therefore, what right have we to behave in that fashion? So that was that one. The third reflection I wanted to have was in a question on miscarriages of justice, which was actually really a very good question that raised a lot of different issues. I wanted to speak on what happened to the mother of three who's just been given a 28-month prison sentence for acquiring abortion pills, and she took them when it was later than you should take them in the law, but she's been sent to prison for 28 months. She has been found guilty under a law that came in 1861. It's not often used. Very few people are sent to prison for breach of that particular law in terms of the way abortion happens. It's a reminder that when people say, now there's nothing wrong, I mean 1861 was when that bill was brought in, with that act, it's Harm to Persons Act, I can't remember quite the title. It's not that it's an old law, just in case you're thinking, because obviously the murder law was brought in the 19th century. I'm not saying, oh, it needs to be updated and modernised, right? But that piece of law was linked to the Abortion Act. That's the significant thing. And hardly ever used, hardly anyone goes to prison for that now, right? It was used when abortion was illegal, but it never got scrapped. It snuck in to the liberalisation of abortion. And it's a reminder that things that are on the statute books, when people say, oh, we'll pass this law, but it'll never be used, no one will ever be sent to prison. Once it's on the statute books, it can be used, and that poor woman is going to prison. Now, I know a lot of people who are anti-abortion say, well, she deserves it, it's ridiculous, and all the rest of it. I'm not suggesting that she shouldn't be prosecuted, because it might have been a breach of the law. But this is the criminal law, she's been sent to prison. It is not in the public interest that she goes there. It's obviously ridiculous. But also, the reason I say it's ridiculous is because the government know it's ridiculous, because they themselves brought in, under lockdown in 2020, a law that struck down the criminalisation of abortion in that way in Northern Ireland. Right, and actually, I was a bit like, well, I don't know, the UK government should be imposing this on Northern Ireland. That was to do with Northern Ireland and, you know, its autonomy for making some rules. But the interesting thing is, they did it because they said, well, you can't send people to prison for abortion. Guess what? You can in England, you can't in Northern Ireland. So I think that it is well time that we looked at criminalisation of abortion. Certainly nobody should be sent to prison in this day and age in the way that has happened, for their own, trying to control their own reproduction, for making a mistake. And also to note, you know, for all the people who are anti-abortion and up in arms, many of those people were anti-lockdown. This was a consequence of lockdown that this happened. You know, one of the reasons why it all got in a muddle was because of lockdown, because normal medical care did not happen properly. So, you know, everyone should bear that in mind. But I know for those who are anti-abortion and up in arms and saying this was murder of a child and so on, this is an argument that you can have, right? It's an argument society can have. I mean, I don't mean you can have. But it is also important that people who say to me, you're on the wrong side on this one, you know, do me a favour, right? I'm on a different side, right? And then we have an argument. Don't make out there's a set of things that I have to go along with. But for me, the criminal law being used in this way is almost accidental. And the judge made the point that he had no choice but to treat this case in the way and send the woman to prison. And he called on parliamentarians to potentially, if they wanted to change things, look again, it would be a parliamentary decision, not a judicial one. So this is, for once, the judge is saying, we won't make the decision, it's up to you parliamentarians. So I'm hoping that it will come to Parliament. And in light of that, there is a demonstration at the Royal Courts of Justice at 1 o'clock on Saturday, which I hope people will go to, calling for law reform and calling for the decriminalisation of abortion. And that, by the way, in and of itself will be an argument and a discussion about what decriminalising means. But for now, I would just simply say, if the state has the power to send you to prison, even if they don't do it often enough, don't think that the law won't be used, because it could be used. And therefore we should think very carefully about what laws are passed that can criminalise people and lead to them having their freedom denied. And in this instance, that woman's 3 children will not have a mother for that time, and it's going to destroy that family. It's a disaster. It's a really wrong decision, in my opinion, and it should have been at least suspended. That's it. My colleagues are over in Berlin, having debating matters with 12 German schools, having real discussions, real debates, and I want to wish them well. I'm now going to go into the chamber and try and get in on question time to raise my favourite leasehold issue. See you next week.